Welcome to a special edition of our Monday Night Memories. And Nate Barrett, our good friend and my colleague many times, and also our partner in this adventure with the Chariot Auto Group and Twin City. Too special of an we recorded something on Friday for Golden Black Live. I think and haven't put it on YouTube yet. So I think it's too good of an interview, not because of the interviewee, but because of the subject matter with Bob Knight and what he's meant to Purdue basketball. Nate, I just wanted to get to, as we open this up real quick, your grandpa, who was so much involved, was Twin City back in the day, Mr. Trout. Bob Knight, you shared a quick, good story about what he meant to you, Bob Knight meant to him, and that relationship over the years.
Well, I think it's important to note, Alan, that my grandfather was originally from Terre Haute, and down there, a lot of IU people, and he got an opportunity with Chrysler Corporation to come up here in late '73 and '74, and he came up here as an IU fan and really remained so his whole life. But it was fun to watch his transformation as George King assigned the car dealers and hooked him together with Gene Keady. And so they became friends over the ensuing decades. But I think Coach Keady, as close as he and my grandfather became, knew that he was kind of 1A, and there was always that love for Bob Knight. So I like to say that on Sundays, Alan, it was very simple. We were going to watch the Bob Knight show and the Gene Keady show, and nobody was going to talk. We were just going to listen.
Yeah, well said. All right, so what you're going to hear there is an interview with Bruce Weber, former Purdue men's basketball assistant coach, and of course coached at Southern Illinois, Kansas State, but worked closely. Has some great stories on his experience with Bob Knight with 18 years on the sideline. Then I'm also Bill Benner from the Indianapolis Star, legendary sports columnist with the Star, covered Knight kind of during the tempestuous time, which they always were. And he covered Purdue, obviously, for many years. And also Mark Montieth, who wrote the book Passion Play, 1987-88, was around Purdue basketball a lot during the Gene Keady Knight era and before. So I think you'll enjoy the interview, and we appreciate the Chariot Auto Group and Twin Cities sponsorship, and enjoy. A sad time for the basketball world, the passing of Coach Bob Knight, but we're very fortunate here to have three folks that knew just about everything that Bob Knight was in the Purdue-Indiana relationship, and that's kind of what our focus is going to be on today, and that very unique situation. I'm joined here by Bruce Weber, former Purdue assistant basketball coach, but obviously a longtime coach at Illinois and Kansas State. Bill Benner, the Indianapolis Star, and many other things in his esteemed journalistic life. And, of course, Mark Montieth, the author of a book on Gene Keady and Bruce Weber and their basketball team in 87-88 called Passion Play, and, of course, has been around Purdue basketball for a long time and continues to do so. So, Bruce, I'm going to start with you just on your thoughts, not only just on Bob Knight's passing, but also just that unique relationship. You were coached against him for 18 years on the sidelines and watched him do what he did, like nobody else did it, so to speak. But talk about that.
Well, it was fun to be part of, and we talk about it all the time. Former players, Coach Keady. I don't know if there's a better rivalry, not just because of the Purdue-Indiana, but when you had Coach Knight and Coach Keady going at it. It added so much to the mix, and it was for a long time also. So when you throw all those things together, it made for a special time, a golden era of college basketball in the state of Indiana. And, first of all, Coach Knight was an amazing coach. I mean, I learned so much as a young coach. At that time, we could scout in person. I'd go down to the Indiana games. I'd watch them, from press row and see the things and watch his tactics and how he dealt with the players and all that stuff. And, so that was, it was amazing. But then to watch our Coach Keady's and his relationship kind of come and go at different times, it was really, it was kind of fun to be part of that. And then just, what he meant for basketball. Coach Knight meant so much for basketball. And, and I know Bill would tell you, Mark would tell you, he did a lot of different things. He was controversial. There's no doubt about it. But as a pure basketball person and how he changed college basketball, what he meant to college basketball, it was a special time and he was an amazing coach.
Bill, you saw him all the way through, as did Mark, but the ups and the downs, the nutty stuff he did, the stuff that made you shake your head, but then also watch him lead a team to national championships. And the Purdue-Indiana rivalry, I mean, you can do your best Gene Keady imitation anytime you want here today, but there was nothing quite like it. And Matt Painter said last night that he thought Bob Knight made Purdue better. He was the standard that Purdue kind of had to shoot for and a focal point of a rivalry. Talk about that from your perspective.
Well, I've never been to Duke, North Carolina. I've seen them both separately. Kentucky, Louisville. Name your great rivalry, and I'm sure that Mark would agree that the times starting when Coach Keady came to Purdue, that run, Mackey Arena and Assembly Hall could not be replicated anytime, anywhere. When you walked, in fact, when I left my home in Indianapolis and drove to those venues, the anticipation would build and build and build.
Oop, lost you for a second. Everybody still there?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bill. You said when you left your Indianapolis home. Go ahead.
Yeah, when you left your Indianapolis home, the anticipation would build and build and build, and then when you walked through the doors and went to your assigned seat in the media section, you just knew you were going to see something incredible. And interestingly, Coach Knight was involved in three of his most notable, infamous acts, starting with Purdue and George King, and the episode with his weekly show, and then the chair throw, and then the rant from Coach Knight, widely recorded and distributed, where I'm sick and bleeping tired of losing to Purdue, and so Keady's ability to bring out both the best and the worst, and Keady and Purdue both brought out the best and worst in Coach Knight, for sure.
Yeah, Purdue and Gene and Bruce had a lot to do with
it. And that's what I'm telling you, okay?
Priceless. 21 wins and 20 losses for Gene Keady against Bob Knight. Mark, you were with them intimately in 87, 88, but just that, and those were two of the best games as well. Not the first one wasn't as good for Purdue, and the Boilermakers got down about 17 or 19 and fought 21, I think it was, fought all the way back, got ahead and lost that game, but then beat the Hoosiers on the back end of that. But just the intensity of that rivalry, you could feel it, like Bill said, almost when you woke up that morning or got in your car to head to the arena. But there was nothing quite like that before or since.
No, the greatest college basketball games I ever covered were Indiana-Purdue games, and so many different things happened. Certainly the loudest basketball environment I've ever been in would have been in Mackey Arena when Indiana came to town. The reason it was louder in Mackey than it was at Assembly Hall is that Mackey was more compact and the acoustics were better for retaining noise, but just tremendous basketball environments. You just had to hold your ears sometimes. It got so loud. And I think those games meant maybe a little more to Purdue fans than IU fans, because Purdue wasn't the underdog situation most years, even though they often had better teams. Indiana had the national championships and all that. So I think that game really meant a lot to the Purdue fans. So just tremendous memories. The very first game that Purdue played against IU, when Gene and Bruce Weber were on that staff, was down at Assembly Hall. And, Knight grabs the referee by his belt and yanks him backward because the referee's blocking his view. And Coach Keady runs out to protest the lack of a technical and then gets a technical foul for doing that. And I still
Too
remember
technical.
this game.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second, Bruce. Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember Keady walking into the post-game press conference and saying, "You guys don't know me very well yet, but I'm not going to put up with that. I'll fight the world. I'll fight their ass till the world falls in." And it was just what a tremendous debut for this rivalry. And there's so many other things that happened over the years we can talk about as well.
Hold on one second. It'll come back, hopefully. I hope it's not my internet situation here. I'm not sure.
I think it might be.
Still there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
You're
okay?
frozen.
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Now you're good.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So just a tremendous college basketball environment, unmatched. The IU Purdue rivalry, it was a big deal in the 1920s, but it's never been better than it was in the 80s and into the 90s.
Bruce, it's so relevant in today's Jim Harbaugh world about scouting opponent. You were up at Minnesota. I love that story, and you've told it probably more times than you care to admit, because you were personally responsible for those two technicals. I think. Tell that story about that. It's not true at all, but you were legally scouting Minnesota, I believe it was, before the first Purdue-IU game in 1981. But tell that story because it's such a classic about Gene's kind of overreaction, but also just that rivalry got started at the highest level in the first game and never could and continue to get better really from that standpoint.
Yeah, I did go scout, and I'm a young guy, Al. I had just grad assistant, then Purdue, and coach sends me out there, and it's my first Big Ten game scouting. It was at Minnesota. Minnesota had a really good team. Obviously, Indiana did also. Minnesota's controlling the game, most of it, and all of a sudden, Coach Knight just starts in on the refs, and the whole momentum game changes. They end up beating them. So, I go back, I give the scouting report to Coach, and I say, "Coach, I'm just naive guy. I had never been that up close to Coach Knight like that." I say, "You can't let him control the game. This is totally wrong. This coach, he just changed the game with how he acted and blah, blah, blah." And so now it's I don't know how many minutes into the game, Mark would maybe remember you.
Not very many. It's
right at the start.
And coach is going crazy, and boom, one technical, two technicals. And coach comes over, and I just said, "Coach, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for you to, go that overboard and get technicals." And he just said, he turned to me and he said, "He knows I'm in the state now," and that was just it. And and then as you said, it just went on, and obviously we had the Rosie Barnes and Isaiah incident there, which led to the mule, which led, it just built and built.
Yeah, it did, and I was on the end of that bench because Alan Kruger was the manager at the time and senior manager, and was sitting at the scores table. So we were running back and forth. In today's world, he'd be out of the game, right? Second technical, yes. But it would have him out before it even started. But I thought, God, that game is never. Purdue's going to lose by 30, and Purdue fought its way back into that game and made it a very. Yes, it was a contested game between Roosevelt Barnes and Isaiah and Keith Edmondson and all the stuff that went on with that. But that just started it. But Bill, you talk about you covered it before Keady got there as well. And there was a lot of, Fred Schaus and Bob Knight did not get along. Fred had a hard time. Lee Rose wasn't there maybe long enough to know. Though he knew, he was fully aware of playing second fiddle. That much I know from personal experience. But talk about just even the genesis of Knight and Purdue in the early days, because there were some classics in the 70s. I mean, between Fred Schaus and when Indiana was number 1 in 75 and 76, their two closest defeats arguably might have been in Mackey Arena. They got out of both those games alive. But talk about just how it all started really before then as well in terms of that Purdue-Indiana relationship.
Well, in much the way that Keady came in and took on Knight and said, he knows I'm in the state now, Knight did the same thing with Purdue.
Yeah.
Because Purdue was probably the better program at that time. And so Knight came in with the idea that if they're going to beat anybody, they had to beat Purdue.
Yeah.
And they had to take on Purdue, and they had to take them on in state recruiting. They had to take them on in the rivalry. But then Knight, in early Knight fashion, certainly went overboard on a couple of occasions in his antics directed at Fred Schaus and then George King, and the rivalry really began to build. But then again, Keady took it to an entirely different level right from the get-go. I was there, and there was also the NIT game. The famous NIT game. So that was a national stage for the rivalry. But again, like I said, I think that Knight felt that in order to control the state, win the state, it started with beating Purdue, and in some cases, trying to make fun of Purdue.
And he did. He tried to do that. And from a Purdue fan's perspective, and even in the year before Bruce got there, my sophomore year, beating Indiana and Lexington, and Lee Rose doing that, on the way to the Final Four was just, and the fact that Knight lost his mind going into the locker room. I don't know if you guys were. I think he probably were both covering that game, but. And got a technical coming out of the thing. I think he, as a manager, would know, and whether it was urban legend or not, he took out all of the water coolers and spilled them over and made the managers clean them up, and then literally sat there with his head in his hands as Purdue just killed him that day in Lexington. There's so many stories from that standpoint. Bruce, tell me about any other, more recent, even in your coaching days at Illinois, on down, any other interactions with Bob Knight, and just in terms of, maybe, and obviously Gene and Bob had the road show in the last few years, which was a great thing. But talk about that interactions as you got into your head coaching career.
Well, first you brought up a couple of things, Al. One about Coach Keady talked about it. Bill just talked about Indiana beating Purdue, and that was one thing Coach always talked about. Our defense was built on how we could beat Indiana. It wasn't, because we had to change some things with their motion and how we guarded things. And that was what, Coach said, we got to be prepared to beat the best. And, at that time, there was no doubt they were the best. So, so you watch that evolve with time. And you did say, Indiana, Coach Knight made us better. And there's no doubt they did. And then Coach's relationship at first, they played golf one time early in the spring, and then they play in the fall, and they bring their pros. It was Joe Campbell, the old golf coach, was Coach's pro, and then Coach Knight had his pro, and then it started getting a little sticky between us, and then the golf was off, and so then at the end, their admiration for each other, they started playing again, and obviously when they did the road show, I never got to go to one of those. But I would have loved to hear it. And Coach always, he enjoyed it so much. And, I think his respect for him, what he did for Indiana, for college basketball, the Big Ten, I know this morning when I talked to him, he was very, very sad to hear the news. So, but for me, I got at Southern Illinois. I got to play him at Texas Tech in the NCAA tournament. And, the other funny part is, and Bill and Mark might know this, he never shook hands with the assistant coaches. He never acknowledged us, ever, So, I'm, for me, it's whatever, 18 years of going there and competing. I didn't know if he knew my name. I didn't know if he, and I always told the story, Steve Lavin, when he joined us, I said, Steve, he won't shake your hand. Oh, he'll shake my hand. My dad, all this stuff. And, Pete Newell and all that. And Steve put his hand out, and Coach Knight just walked right through it and hit Coach's stomach, and he just moved through. So, but, when I got the head job at Southern Illinois, I was at the Peach Jam or one of the recruiting venues, summer AU stuff, and all of a sudden I hear Weber, and I'm like looking around, who's and then he Weber, and then he grabbed, how he grabbed you, he grabbed me, I didn't even know, and he just, I want to congratulate you, I think that's great, blah blah blah. And he went on, and then a couple of years later we played him in the NCAA tournament, and it was obviously a huge win for us at Southern. got to the Sweet 16, and and I got to do some clinics with him along the way. After he was retired, Nike brought him back, or Championship Productions, whatever it's called, brought him back to do clinics. So it was cool to be around him and to have a chance to visit with him and learn basketball. Oh, the other good story. So he's got our Illinois game, and he's announcing the NIT. Yeah. And Hannah, our oldest, who got Coach Knight at 10 years old to turn around and look and give her the stare at the first Big Ten tournament. Hannah went up to him before the game. He's doing announcing in New York, and he said, "Coach Knight, I'm Coach Weber's daughter. It's a pleasure to meet you. I've been yelling at you since 10 years old." And oh God, he just laughed, and he was so, and he wanted to take a picture with her. And then of course, in Coach Knight style, he's walking away and he slaps her on the butt. So she will always remember she had her butt slapped by Coach Knight.
Oh, before the Me Too movement ever took hold, he used to do that coming into Mack Arena. He'd fake like he was going to hit one of the Boiler Babes or whatever they were called at the time. Some great stuff. And boy, Bill Benner, how he hated the Big Ten tournament. And of course, Purdue, I think, was the first team to take him out. Right? That was a tight game, and on a Friday, that first when Purdue went to the Big Ten championship game. When Bruce, that was your last year in West Lafayette. But
yeah,
you look at that and say, just all the stuff that, from a reporter standpoint, he loved to make fun of journalists, and the old second grade comment, about learning to write and all that kind of stuff. Did you ever have Bill, I'll ask you first, a lighter side with him at all? Because you were antagonistic toward him. You were right 99% of the time, I get. But did you ever have a moment with him after the fact that where things were a little bit more at peace?
Well, Mark knows this. Every journalist, well, in fact, virtually everybody that Knight would associate with, would eventually come to a crossroads. Yeah. And I can give you specifically, my crossroads came in 1984 before a Michigan State IU game in Assembly Hall. But before that, I had covered as a sidebar writer, I covered the 76 national championship team. I covered, 81. And so I had what I thought to be a decent relationship with the man, up to the point where there would be occasions where he would call and ask about my daughters.
Yeah.
Just out of the blue. Hey, Coach Knight, I think he's getting ready to cuss me out. And then he would ask about my girls and how they were doing, and so yeah, so I did have a good relationship with him up until a point where I began to publicly take exceptions to some of the things he was doing in representation of the IU basketball, and in particular the alma mater. So I came to my crossroads, and I never returned to my crossroads. I assume, Mark, you might have had a point like that as well.
Well, I was going to say, Mark, your book was certainly an answer to Season on the Brink in a little bit different terms, only because you were dealing with a different guy, too. It wasn't like you had any less journalistic integrity than John Feinstein. You just had a different program you were dealing with. But talk about that, and just in your relationships with him, any of the one-on-one moments or moments over the years. Did he ever give you grief about writing Purdue books or any of that kind of stuff?
Well, he didn't give me grief, but I think it had an impact. I went to IU and covered his team for the Indiana Daily Student my senior year, which was the only year his team did not go to a postseason tournament, that 76-77 season, the year after they won the national championship. And, we got along okay. He kicked me out of practice one day in the preseason because of something somebody else had written in the student paper. So that was an interesting situation, and Knight actually was right. Somebody had made a mistake, an honest mistake of mistaking something that happened in the football press boxes, and thought Knight had thrown a little ashtray against a window. It turned out to be the guy sitting next to Knight. So that had to be cleared up. But after that, we had a normal relationship and continued to, for the most part. But after I split the season with Purdue and wrote Passion Play, I was pretty much on the outs. I guess he viewed me as a traitor. With Knight, you were either with him or against him. You were in his corner or you're an outsider, and there's really no in between for very long. And that was frustrating as a journalist. I covered IU for the Indianapolis Star in the 90s when Brian Evans was the senior, and he would not grant me an interview. He would not answer my questions in a post-game press conference. Even at the end of the year, I lobbed up one to just about talk about Brian Evans' career, and I don't feel like talking about Brian Evans today. He wouldn't even do that, which to me is awfully petty because, this is about Brian Evans, not about me. And so that's how he could be at times. And that was pretty much the end of it. I mean, after that, I covered the Pacers, and that was the rest of my career. So I didn't have other meetings with him. But, he was difficult. He could be very engaging. Bill would tell you in an NCAA tournament environment with national media there, he'd turn on the charm and be funny and, fill up your notebook really quick, that kind of thing. But he, you just couldn't have a normal relationship with him from a media standpoint. And that's one thing I always appreciated about Coach Keady was that you could, he might get mad at you about something but still, it was over with at some point, and you could always have access as long as you were fair to him. So it was just very difficult from a journalistic standpoint to cover a Bob Knight team because, he wanted to manipulate. He was a manipulator above all else. And I even remember him joking about that one time on Media Day when I was a student at IU. He knew it, and he worked that way, and he'd grant you little favors if you were in his corner and never wrote anything you didn't like. But, once you did write something you didn't like, as Bill will tell you, you were an outsider and, he wouldn't even answer your questions. So challenging. He made all the other coaches look really good. I always think, this guy's great. He'll answer a question or he'll return a phone call, whatever. So it was good training for a young journalist to cover a Bob Knight team.
But Mark is right. Knight would go into the NCAA tournament setting, and he would be this charming, eloquent, and he would tell stories in depth. And the national media that didn't interact with him on a day in, day out basis, he just had them eaten out of his hands. It was amazing how he could go into those environments, and we'd all sit back and go, "Where is this guy?" Where's this guy on a Thursday night post game in West Lafayette? Not there. So
I don't know where we're going to go back to the conversation. It's just kind of like free flowing, but there are so many stories and amazing things that have happened to all of you in that role. I think too, Bruce, you look at I guess the game you have to talk about, and I think all of you were probably in attendance, was the chair game. And in 1985, February 23rd, if my memory serves me correct. And I'll start with Bruce on that one, just because, again, that was such an amazing, and I wasn't there. I've never seen Purdue win an Assembly Hall, if you can believe that. And that's why I haven't been back since 2000. But the whole thing of what that was like and your memories of that, just sitting there and knowing that you knew something was up because he was wearing a golf shirt into the game. Something was up.
It was a warm day. It was a
warm day. I do remember that, even being in West Lafayette. But Bruce, I'll let you get started with this story and what that was like for you as you recall it.
Yeah, there was it was hostile or whatever, and something was brewing, like you talked about. And the thing I always say is I was amazed how, and I think he did some of this on his own. He took the attention away from the team, and put it on himself. And I always talked about it. I wished as a coach, later on as a head coach especially, I could have had those, brilliant thoughts of, I'm going to do this, so they talk about me instead of. But he did it all the time.
That was manipulation, like Mark talked about. But go ahead.
Yeah, to take the pressure off the team, and you kind of felt like maybe that was starting. But whoever thought about the chair? And I still remember Steve shooting the free throw read, and Coach Keady's turned his back, and so now I'm sitting there watching, and everyone, you guys all know I grab Coach all the time, and I grabbed him, and he got mad. What do you want? I said, Coach, and he goes, what? And I pointed, and there, the chair was flying, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and we were like, oh my goodness, it's just, And then it just kind of went from there. And then the fans started throwing coins on the court, and coach would pick them up and hold them up and say, thank you, give thumbs up. And he's putting it in his pocket. But then it got pretty hostile. There's no doubt. And, it got crazy even after the game, the whole thing.
He never mentioned it I'm sure, in any way, shape, or form. I never heard him really talk about it after the event. He never talked about it. He never issued an apology. My guess is, Bruce, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, not that I know of, and I doubt it.
Not the apologizing type, I don't think. Mark, I assume you were there, but tell me what your memories were.
I was there, and yeah, it was a shock. That's something you had never seen before at a basketball game. You think you've seen everything at some point, but haven't seen that before or since. Bruce was just talking about the hostile environment and fans throwing coins. I remember one of them ricocheted and hit Pat Keady in the eye.
Yeah.
She left Assembly Hall with a patch over one eye. So, it was a dangerous environment, but it was a classic case of mob mentality with the fans all worked up. Not only had Knight been kicked out, but Purdue was winning the game. Yeah. And so it was a classic case of mob fever, and fans throwing things, and Pat Keady paid a price for that. So it was amazing, just amazing. People talk about how sometimes today's coaches aren't tough, like Coach Knight was, but there were no coaches before Coach Knight like Coach Knight. There were not coaches who did the things he did in the 40s and 50s and 60s, at least that I'm aware of. So he was pretty much one of a kind, and that day was a perfect example.
Yeah, Bill, the year before, Purdue had gone on a 22-0 run, I want to say, to beat Indiana for the first time in Bruce and Gene's tenure in Assembly Hall. I think that may have had a little something to do with it. Now, Purdue had beaten them early in the year, I think in 84-85. Purdue beat them by 10 or whatever in Mackey, but talked about just, again, he was very keenly aware of that rivalry. I don't know if that had anything to do with him throwing the chair that day. It was just utter frustration. I think Bruce's point is well taken, but your take on that whole.
Well, there was always the discussion after that happened whether Knight was premeditated. Yeah. Whether he, the issue of not wearing the sport jacket, but being in the short sleeve shirt, and whether Knight came into Assembly Hall that day with the intention that he was going to light the place up, which he did.
Yeah.
And like Mark, then the press area was right behind center court, elevated, and we were just all stunned and shocked at what we had witnessed. And the thing I remember, Keady coming in after the game and making the point that about his team.
Yeah, this is Purdue, not Purdue.
And Keady handled it as well as it could have been handled. I mean, he had every right to go Keady-ish had he wanted to, but I thought Gene handled it in a very classy manner and focused on what had just occurred, which was a resounding Purdue victory. But it was, and I was there as a columnist, and so I was there to write opinion that day. Phil Richards was he wrote the lead story, the game story, and I wrote the column. And obviously I wasn't very kind, but how could you be when you've seen such one of the most outrageous things ever?
I think that column is still hanging in the SID office, though it's been torn down. The one, I think, that was the Purdue flag or whatever it was, and everybody thought Bill Benner was Jesus Christ after that around West Lafayette because of that column. Now, little did they know that Bill was just a very good, impartial journalist telling it like it was. He was not a Purdue fan, but necessarily, but certainly a fan. Everybody had to be a fan of that relationship between the basketball relationship between Gene Keady and Bob Knight. Bruce, talk about recruiting. I've always, it used to be, I can remember Bob King, and we all remember Bob, the former Purdue assistant coach and longtime administrator, used to say probably a little bit before the Keady era, he said, Bob Knight would never admit to losing a recruit to Purdue. Yes. He would never say the name, and he would never admit. He said he never lost one. No, that's not true. It's close, but talk about just that, that challenge. You had a number of guys over the years that as I recall, that and this is not necessarily all that much different now. It is some, but the whole fact, the Calvert Cheneys of the world and others that you guys spend a lot of time on, and Knight just decides, I don't know, and this is probably wrong, but kind of decides in the last minute, well, I think we like Calvert and we want to take him, and off he goes. But talk about what it was like to recruit not only against Indiana basketball, but against Bob Knight.
It was really tough at the beginning when we got there. Obviously, they were coming off national championship and Olympics, the whole bit, and he controlled the state in the recruiting part. And at that time we could have 15 scholarships. And we kind of felt, even as a staff, that when we were in on somebody and he didn't want us to get them, all of a sudden he would recruit them. So he, not with in mind, obviously Calvert Cheney was a little later than some of the guys, but he just decided, hey, I'm going to get him, and he's not going to Purdue. And the big, it started then. You talked about he wouldn't admit. I think the big one was Troy Lewis.
Yes, and
that was our big kind of, we got the marquee guy, but I kind of watched Coach Knight, as you talked about. He would put feelers out to see if they could get involved, how Purdue was, and if he didn't lose them because he took himself out.
Yes.
I think when there were certain ones, and even Glenn, they made a go at it, and so there were certain guys, but at the beginning it was really hard and frustrating. I'm a young guy and I'm just starting out with this stuff. And, at that time, there are no limits. We're going to see kids all the time. And, you're putting all this time and effort, and then all of a sudden, boom, we're out. And we had parents say, I will never send my son to play for Coach Knight. And then a week later, he commits to Indiana, and we're like, wait a minute, what did you say, Mom? But
there's names like Matt Nover. I can remember you guys were on him, and the last minute, boom. And again, this is from my point of view. I didn't know any of the total details. You know it a lot better, but there certainly seemed to be a few of those from that standpoint that made it even all the more interesting in terms of that relationship.
He was great with moms, especially grandmas. He could really turn that tide with that part.
Mm-hmm. And Bill, I'll go to you, and both you and Mark, I think, were probably maybe at Gene Keady's first press conference when he was hired at Purdue. I don't know where you were that April day back in 1980, but I do remember Gene saying, because it was. After Lee Rose left, it was not a warm and fuzzy time for Purdue-Indiana relations, especially even though Purdue had beaten Indiana the year before and gone to the Final Four. But I do remember Gene saying, somebody asked him, maybe it was one of you two, that said, well, you kind of like Bob Knight and all about that. But that was genuine. I mean, there was a respect there from the get-go. And I guess, Bill, I'll let you comment on that first.
Well, and I would say, there was genuine respect, and it's what people didn't see, especially in the years that have gone on since they weren't coaching against each other. The respect and admiration, and I dare say love that the two men have for each other. And I've told many people, and I've talked to Gene about it on occasion, about his insistence that he would stay in contact with Coach Knight, even as Coach Knight struggled. And I will. That's another reason I love Gene Keady, because loyalty, and he set aside the most fierce rival of all to be loyal to a man that he loved and respected and admired. One of the best things I did in my post-career, when I was with Pacer Sports Entertainment, we had the Hickory Night celebrations, and we were able to bring Gene and Coach Knight there on that February night to be recognized. And I played a significant role in that. But once they got there, so I was certainly in the background. But it was one of the most heartwarming things that I've been involved with. And I still remember the crowd and how incredibly warm and receptive they were to seeing Coach Keady and Coach Knight at then Conseco Fieldhouse. But Gene's, like I said, he set aside the most fierce rivalry of all time out of love and respect for Coach Knight. What does that say?
Yeah, that says a lot. Mark, and you were around, obviously, writing the book in 87, 88, and I believe that was also the time that his mom and dad, Gene's mom and dad, came to West Lafayette, or at least you may have had the chance to be around him. I thought Gene said something very interesting to me this morning. I really didn't even ask for it. It was like we were about ready to hang up, and he said, "You know what? He was most like my dad. He was like my dad." He said, "I loved and respected him." He used the love word, but he said, "But I didn't mess with him." I love that. I said, I do not mess with him. Apparently, and I met Lloyd, the dad, who was a gardener, right? And Bruce was far more than was a gentle, nice soul, but apparently not all the time for Coach Keady. But Mark, talk about just that relationship, maybe from that perspective. I think you may have had a chance to meet Gene's parents, but also that role and that ultimate respect that Gene has always had for his elders, which I always thought was which we all were raised to be that way, I suppose. But he was extra special from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember meeting Coach Keady's parents late in the season in 87, 88. And I never thought about that his dad was like Coach Knight. I can't imagine his dad
I didn't either.
Too much like Coach Knight, but I do remember Coach Keady telling me how, when he was growing up, if you talk back to dad, he'd knock you through the screen door, that kind of thing. So, I guess he did have a temper, but certainly people in that era would have respect for your elders. And Coach Knight came out of the same era. A lot of people don't realize, I think, that Coach Keady is actually older than Coach Knight.
5 years older.
He got to Purdue, a decade after Coach Knight got to IU, but Coach Keady actually had been around longer, came from a slightly earlier era. I might throw in, to me, of all the great years of the rivalry that those two coaches had, to me, the peak was the 86-87 season when they shared the Big Ten championship. And the equality of the two teams, each team won its home game that season by 11 points. And I remember the second game at Purdue, all 10 starters were averaging double figures. That's how balanced they were. And these were not high-scoring teams. So for every starter on both teams to be averaging in double figures really told you about how they played and how balanced they were. And they were just fantastic games. The games of 87, 88 were good as well. But that 87, 88 season when they shared the Big Ten championship, to me, would stand as the peak season of that great rivalry, just for the equality. And of course, they went on divergent paths in the NCAA tournament. Purdue got a bad bid, and has to go to Syracuse, and IU plays in Indianapolis and wins the national championship. But the regular season, then, boy, nothing was better than those two games.
Yeah, I think I think you're right on that one. It was unbelievably even that year, and in the intensity. If StubHub had been around in those days, I could only think about. I mean, heck, I have Section 7, Row 7 tickets at Mackey right now, and you can get up $300 or $400 for them. In today's, it's crazy, but then it would have been. It might have even been more from that standpoint. Okay, one of the great things I think we can all agree is that Gene Keady and Bruce had so much to do with this, with Gene Keady getting to the Hall of Fame this year. And that was a special moment for anybody that loves basketball. It was emotional. It was a big deal. But talk about, I guess, maybe as we kind of bring this to a close, which is an impossible thing to do here, I get. But I want to talk about just that Hall of Fame level, and I'll let each of you comment. And Bruce, I'll start with you. The fact that what these guys have meant for basketball. Now, and I know the rivalry has been what it was, and it's great. It certainly is probably on the Mount Rushmore of college basketball rivalries. It'd be hard to argue with that, probably. But just the fact that now Gene is joined in that elite status with Bob Knight and what that all means. Bruce, I'll start with you.
Yeah, one, I'm going to tell a quick story, and
and you guys got all day. If you can tell stories all day long if you want.
Well, I was in charge of tickets, as you know, for all those years.
Oh, yeah.
We went to Indiana. We only had like I don't know, you get 60
36
tickets or something. And they only a few were behind the bench. And I snuck people in. Oh, this is our doctor. This is our dentist. This is our nurse. I mean, and the guy would like look
I remember.
at me. And I said, once you get in, you can you find a seat. I'm not responsible. Don't tell him I got you. Because coach would always promise out too many tickets. And I would I'm stuck. And, he said, get him in. Okay, coach, I'll get him in. So
I held the door, I think, a couple times by the locker. We'd actually sneak him into the locker room, as I recall. But go ahead.
Well, I was so happy for Coach Keady to get in there. And if you think about it, the rivalry, we talked earlier, Coach Knight, the years, the teams, but for both of them to be in the same state and both be in the Hall of Fame. I mean, it's incredible, to be honest. And it all added up to it. And I was hoping, we talked many times, Al, about Coach getting in. When you add up all his from high school, I always say Coach did everything, high school to junior college, assistant coach, to the head coach for a long time, one of the winningest coaches in the history of the Big Ten, USA basketball, multiple times, gold medals, and then also even helped in the NBA. So, and I didn't know if he's going to get in. And the only sad part for me is he didn't get his health is not quite as good now, and he didn't get to totally enjoy it. But man, he was proud. We were all proud. Troy, Todd, and Everett were there for the ceremony. Steve Scheffler, Kurt Clausen, Tom Izzo flew in just to walk him up, which said so much to me, about what Tom's about. And we had stories. We were just rolling up on before the. That evening they have a pre-banquet or whatever reception, and it was those guys were up there, the former players, and Tom Izzo and Coach Keady. I mean, we had people like big time college coaches up there just rolling because one story after the other. So it was see Coach get it and be part of it. I couldn't be prouder, and I was so happy that he got in.
Yeah, no question. Mark, put it on that perspective of, again, the Hall of Fame level and just from a national perspective. And Bob Knight probably raised Gene Keady's level of national notoriety as well, just because Knight was already at that level before Gene got the job at Purdue, and Gene worked his way into that. But put that in some level of perspective as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were a little bit surprised that Coach Keady got in because of the whole Final Four national championship thing, but I'm glad he did, and he certainly deserved it. The thing people need to keep in mind is that, and Bruce knows this, the playing fields are not level in college basketball.
No.
To be the coach at Purdue is not the same as being the coach at IU, particularly after Knight had been there for a decade. And we've often all heard about how when Coach Keady was considering taking the job at Purdue, Al McGuire told him, don't take that job. You got Bob Knight in Bloomington and Digger Phelps up in South Bend. You're not going to recruit in that state against those two guys. And he did it anyway and gradually built a national caliber program. So that is a Hall of Fame performance right there. He had so many headwinds at Purdue that Bob Knight did not have at IU. And I could go into a long dissertation on how fortunate Bob Knight was in his early years at IU to get some of the players he got and inherit some of the players he got. So Coach Keady did not have those advantages, and yet had a winning record against Bob Knight and played him toe-to-toe for so many years. So so many factors go into winning a championship or getting to a Final Four, but you got to look at the overall body of work, and certainly Coach Keady's body of work was a Hall of Fame performance.
Yeah. Final word, Bill. What say you on not only the Hall of Fame, but just any other things you want to bring to the fray on Gene Keady and Bob Knight's legacy together?
Well, Hall of Fame coaches representing a Hall of Fame rivalry, and being a lifelong Hoosier, basketball is our game.
Yeah.
I've always sincerely believed that, championed it, written about it, promoted it, and it only seems fitting then that the two most influential coaches of that era in the Big Ten, in the most competitive conference in the country, would both end up with Hall of Fame distinction. And to circle it all the way back, those years, and Mark knows this, and Bruce, you lived it from the sideline. And Al, those years, that rivalry was unmatched. And again, you give me Duke, North Carolina, whomever it might be. And it was unmatched because Gene, getting back to the Hall of Fame, Gene came in he was going to take on the world. And if that meant taking on Bob Knight, he was going to do whatever he did to represent Purdue in a first class. And Purdue, those teams embodied the Purdue ethic. I mean,
no doubt.
They were Purdue.
Yeah.
And so when I learned that Coach Keady was going to the Hall of Fame, I immediately messaged him and tried to, in a few words, tell him how much it was overdue and much deserved, as so many people did. But again, for Knight and Keady, and then Indiana and Purdue to be represented in the Hall of Fame is only fitting for the state of Indiana and our rich basketball tradition.
Yeah, and maybe in some ways Matt Painter and Mike Woodson kind of to help that continue on too. It's different, I understand, but it is something that still is going on between the two schools. Gentlemen, it's been a privilege for me. I mean, three of my favorite people, and to share this time. And again, we could do this for 3 or 4 weeks, if not hours. So I appreciate that so much today, and we'll do it again. Bill Benner, you and I haven't talked in way too long. So,
that's right.
You've been such a good friend over the years. So, guys, all right. Thanks to Bruce Weber, Bill Benner, Mark Montieth for their insight. Really fun interview. There's so many stories going around after Bob Knight's passing last week, and Nate, really fun stuff to hear.
Well, it's great. The interview was fantastic, and those guys are, along with you, Alan, experts to the era. And I think about Coach Knight and his arm around Bob DeMoss coming down that tunnel at Mackey right before tip-off, and of course all the Purdue fans going crazy. A lot of wonderful memories for a whole swath of all of us that love basketball in our state.
All right, Nate, thanks so much for your sponsorship, and we will see you later in the week when we got a little Purdue football Boilermaker sports wrap. Nate is always good at making that show flow beautifully. So again, thanks again. Have a great rest of the day for all of you. Thanks for watching and listening, and stay tuned for more Monday Night Memories. We're going to do one on Terry Dissinger here before long as well.